transportation is the bloodstream of sustainable cities, sustainable industries, sustainable communities. Now, with that, sustainability is, I think, the future fuel. And I don't mean that from a fossil fuel perspective, but sustainability will drive the way in which transportation will enable the lifeblood of cities and industries and communities to continue in mobility, to continue to engage in the personal freedom created through mobility, to be able to move product, service, and technology in an effective, low-carbon, circular way. The really important thing for us is that the transportation then isn't just about moving goods. It's about connecting people to opportunity.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to chat with me today.
Well, thank you kindly, Ms. Emily. I don't know why I'm doing that accent, but thank you kindly for the invite.
It adds a bit of flair.
Yes, indeed.
You can either maintain that accent or go back to your other one. But if you'd like to give maybe a bit of an introduction about yourself, your role, and then something you're passionate about.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm passionate about being a Southern Belle by the sound of it. No, so Andrew Petersen is me. I am the CEO of the almost 34-year-old Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. It's been around quite a while, not as long as yours truly, but quite a while. And we are, or I am, probably more accurately, a proud member, or a humble member actually, of the ITLS Board of Advice. What am I passionate about? I kind of recoil at that question, to be honest, because it leads to, so you're passionate, but in this area, shouldn't you be professional? So I like to think that I'm passionate about being professional in helping business leaders turn sustainability ambition into action and ultimately accountability. Since about 2011, I've seen a really interesting movement on sustainability, which I'm sure you're going to get into. And I've just been so humbled by the fact that I've been able to be and have a front row seat in relation to what's been going on.
So my first question is kind of more broad, or my second question. So since stepping into your current role at the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia, or BCSD Australia, what have been some of the most significant shifts that you've observed in how Australian businesses are approaching sustainability?
Wow, talk about go back in the Wayback Machine. Yeah, it's a really interesting question to ask, particularly in these current circumstances in 2025 with a new administration in the United States and conversations about the role of climate change impacting asset allocation and changes in, or no change in the governance model at a national level in Australia. There's lots happening at the moment. The change I would I would summarize the change since 2011, since I started, as sustainability now defines market leadership, not just reputation. And that means that there has been so much happening to bring about data, metrics, analysis, mindset, development of systems change in a relatively short period of time from a business perspective, that we now see that which was historically treated, at least in, even 2011, as CSR, or corporate social responsibility, as a sort of a side project. It's now all about where you find growth in your business. And just as importantly, you're finding it now being asked not just by C-suite and the management, but it's actually starting to not necessarily be embedded, but certainly asked at a board level. So we've kind of shifted from this why should we to how fast can we deliver. And Australian companies are no different in that respect to any other jurisdictional region in the world where companies operate. They increasingly understand that sustainability is not a cost. It's actually an investment in resilience, increasingly in markets and in some for some stakeholders, it's an investment in relevance, and ultimately it's about how there are new forms of value being created by realizing that there are other factors to take into account, whether that is the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, whether it is the dependency that you as a company that operates, which draws down on the environment and nature in particular in such a way that it's going to erode nature as an asset class for a whole community, or in the social sciences, how you as a business are going to grow in an era rather where digitalization is going to have such a profound effect in relation to jobs and skills going forward.
And I haven't heard the term CSR in
I know. Well,
gosh.
yeah, I know. Particularly given that it's also a company name, it's quite funny. But yes,
Yes.
CSR is it long gone? Uh, in most realms, and certainly I could say with some pride in most of our members. But yeah, you still see it sometimes. Yeah.
You've mentioned, or you've made reference to kind of international and then Australia and kind of back again. How do we ensure that maybe there is alignments between the standards that we have here in Australia versus maybe international standards on sustainability while still being able to address unique local challenges within our home markets?
Yeah. And very topical question at the moment. Um, I would paraphrase it. The way I think about it is when somebody asks me that exact question is the global standards give us the compass, but local actions chart the course because we are to a certain extent the masters of our own destiny in the context of others. So, to quote Shakespeare, we are all players on a stage, but we get to decide and determine what actions we play on that stage. So, in the case of BCSD Australia, because it's part of the world network under the World Business Council for Sustainable Development of 67 other organisations like ourselves, we have a fairly unique perspective of that exact issue, whereby the global standards through then global frameworks like ISSB, and increasingly and interestingly, the introduction of the CSRD and the CSDD, so we're talking about reporting requirements in the European Union, whilst they're not being exactly followed in other jurisdictions, including Australia, they are very much operationalizing themselves in other markets: Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, where there is what's called reciprocity. In other words, they're fairly close to one another and they speak to one another, but they do recognize local advantage.
Mm.
So it's important that the standards give us the compass, as I say, but the action has to chart the course. And we find that in our own work in BCSD, this notion of systemic change, of which standards play and frameworks play a really important role, they do have to be adapted to the nuance of market, geography, and community because we are different and we don't have the same attitudes in some respects. So, for example, sustainability does mean something different to an American or a US business than it does compared to an Australian or a European or an Asian business. And that's because of different values. It's different stakeholders. It's different markets. It's all different. But the underlying thread of relevance that those global standards apply, I think, is something that has found its way into each and every business approach increasingly in this modern era of sustainability reporting. And it's actually governments that seem to have caught up with that.
Mm.
So the traditional reality was that it was government that set the tone by reason of legislation and regulation, but increasingly it's the attitudinal response of business to those challenges that then forces a dialogue into jurisdictions to respond to it. And we found that through our work under a program of work, a framework that's been going on now for almost 10 years, actually, called Reporting Matters. And we undertake a review of each and every one of our members' reporting performance through their reports each and every year to kind of benchmark how they're performing. Not just through global expectation, but also through an Australian lens. So do you factor in local supply chains and regional social response priorities and, the different climate realities that exist in Australia? And it's interesting how you find our companies perform, and I say this quite honestly, they perform just as well as others. We often think that we sit in an environment where we are insulated from and therefore don't behave as well as other jurisdictions. But in quite often in a number of cases, we are actually outperforming international competition. International competitors in other sectors in really interesting ways. Why? Because we've responded to those particular circumstances in a different way. So, yeah, I would say that we're not going to see, notwithstanding what the Trump US administration has been indicating, I don't think we're going to see any companies resiling from the need for these kind of global standards to manifest themselves. And then the brutal reality is that it's least cost. If you know that as an international company that, broadly speaking, the way in which ISSB S2, as it's manifest in Australian accounting standards under ASRS 2, basically say it's the same thing, you know that the cost of compliance isn't going to be nearly as high. Whereas if Australia did its own thing compared to the US, compared to others, that adds up to cost. And that's not a good thing when you're trying to embed sustainable development into the operations and supply chains of a company in Australia, let alone a company anywhere else.
One thing you mentioned right at the beginning was that you were also part of the board of advice at the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies at the University of Sydney. I thought it would be good to kind of join these two conversations together because people might be thinking, how does your expertise in your role at BCSD Australia cross over with an industry or an organization rather that focuses on the transport and logistics side?
Yes. And how does it, she says.
Yes.
So we have a program of work in relation to mobility, and we've been a staunch supporter of ITLS for some considerable time, as the University of Sydney Business School is the member within the BCSD Australia, and the ITLS and its program of work speaks naturally to the work that we do on mobility. And why is that? Because, again, you go back to the business imperative around some of these topics, and transportation is the bloodstream of sustainable cities, sustainable industries, sustainable communities. Now, with that, sustainability is, I think, the future fuel. And I don't mean that from a fossil fuel perspective, but sustainability will drive the way in which transportation will enable the lifeblood of cities and industries and communities to continue in mobility, to continue to engage in the personal freedom created through mobility, to be able to move product, service, and technology in an effective, low carbon, circular way. The really important thing for us is that the transportation then isn't just about moving goods. It's about connecting people to opportunity. And that's what I've found through the guise of one David Henscher, who leads the ITLS, really is a legend in that particular work. And so I'm kind of humbled by the fact that I sit on the board of advice, being able to give insights into the corporate sustainability expertise, in the transportation conversation that they engender. And hopefully we are helping give them some international insights as to the transport and mobility pathway which we run as part of BCSD. Because the change in transportation has become profound, and in such a short period of time. I mean, we were not talking about the role and the presence of electric vehicles in our transport mix 10 years ago. So it's not hypothetical, I don't think, to talk about transport and mobility not being part of the sustainability agenda. It is absolutely. But what's really important, and this is where I think David and his team and the research, and for that matter, the educational insights that they give, is really about the practical implications of that, whether it's increasingly conversations around decarbonisation and resilience. I would like to think they'll be talking soon explicitly about social inclusion. They do talk about it implicitly, but it's one of those conversations I think that we're going to see really take prominence in a conversation about how a city changes, how people will ultimately find their way in a decarbonised world, being able to engage in the same way or even better than they were in the past. The one that I don't think that they've yet looked at, and I think it would be encouraging to think about, is circularity in
Mm.
design, particularly as vehicles and battery recycling are going to become ubiquitous and therefore and ever present, and therefore we're going to have to deal with that issue. But the one that ITLS is probably most famous for is data sharing, is the data acquisition and then the sharing to optimize efficiency, and I think by implication, resilience. And so they're really going to be highly prized over the next 10, 15, 25 years as we understand how that data helps us build better decarbonisation pathways.
My next question is around ESG, and I was kind of thinking out as you were talking that maybe ESG is the new CSR in a way. So companies are integrating environmental, social, and governance, so ESG factors, um, into their core business strategies. But I guess the question is, how are they doing that? How are they integrating or addressing these things when they're looking at their strategic plans?
Let's define some terms. So ESG, in most part, means the definitional requirements of the investment and finance sector in relation to the activities of companies on environmental, social, and governance matters. So it's a laser-like lens of certain activities and data that tells the investor how they're performing on climate reduction, how they are performing on workplace agenda, and in particular, gender diversity. That kind of drills down in particular elements, whereas the sustainable development agenda is a much broader one that looks at this whole societal impact around development, and therefore is kind of the macrocosm to the ESG microcosm. And what's happened, particularly in the last couple of years, and this is because the finance sector has become particularly interested in receiving data that helps them better weight the risk associated with these companies in relation to these new issues, climate change. We kind of see that as the only proxy that we have to worry about. Whereas if you look at, let's take the example of Indigenous engagement. Australian companies have for a long time, even before closing the gap, been highly conscious of the social impact they have and the social license that they draw from the Indigenous community. And that's particularly true of the mining sector. It's less so of other sectors, but each sector in their own way recognises that there is a historical point of disadvantage for disenfranchised communities, of which the Indigenous peoples of Australia have been a clear example that have been left behind. How has that manifest itself? Well, it's done it in such a way that the work of certainly the ASX 100 in developing what's called reconciliation action plans has been going on for some time. And I'm not talking 5 years, I'm talking a good almost 20 years in some cases. And those plans are not just statements of good intent. They've often been associated with important initiatives and certainly intent to have disenfranchised or disadvantaged communities and peoples playing, so far as they're concerned, a role in the way in which their business creates value. What we haven't seen, though, is a framing of how you find, and I'll go back to the example of Indigenous peoples, how you find the role of self-economic determination for them in a capitalist environment. Now, that's not an ESG issue. That's a sustainable development issue because it's talking about social impact and the role of inequality and more broadly human rights. And what's interesting about that is that it's one that is very much on the radar of a lot of business at the moment with no real answer to it. So when you ask the question about how companies integrate, they're looking at what are those key signals that are happening within society and, for that matter, in nature, that need to be thought of in terms of the materiality risk or the business risk that's going to bring some change in the way in which they make money, create value for a society over time. And those who are in a leadership position or who are at the cutting edge are looking at how they integrate that into the decision-making process. The majority of the time, to be blunt, most companies are willing to wait for somebody to tell them how to do it. And that's how we find regulation coming about, where at a certain point, those who have led start to bleed and say, well, it's not fair that we are exercising this level of high performance, and there are free riders in a society that are not actually in the business community, actually towing the line or doing their bit. So that becomes, I think, at the end of the day, it will depend on a partnership, not on a silo. And that becomes an interesting conversation for another webinar potentially on the role of ESG in capitalism, because capitalism actually highly prizes a competitive market that shows and understands what true value is to the raw inputs that are being put into it, because it creates value from it. But ESG adds then a whole new lens to the way in which you look at those inputs.
Speaking of value creation and capitalism, how do you see ESG frameworks shaping investment priorities, particularly in the transport sector? So you've mentioned a couple. You mentioned electrification and then a little bit of decarbonisation. How else do you think
Yeah.
it might impact the decisions?
Yeah. Let's look at the future state. I think tomorrow's transport investments are going to be zero emissions, digital first, and human centric. So if you work on that premise, the capital markets are going to reward infrastructure, fleets, and logistics that align to that premise. So the whole issue of what electrification looks like is not a question of what the heck is Elon Musk doing? It is a profound century change to the way in which people move. So that's the first thing. Then you've got data and the role it's going to play around logistics optimization. And that's people logistics as well as things logistics, because the way you move people is going to be just as important, because there are more people in more cities over time right across the world. We see that in Australia writ large. And so data is going to better inform. And again, we'll go back to my point about ILS being so valuable in that, because in my experience, just observing David and his team, they're not just studying the future of transport, they're actually shaping it. And with that, the work that they're doing is going to better inform the capital markets and governments around what needs to be invested in to respond to that. So already ITLS does a lot of work in relation to the impact of or the role of modal changes and the shifts. That's going to be really important when it comes to how those shifts reduce emissions. Because we only think about it in terms of, well, COVID changed the way in which we use public transport, but it also reduced emissions enormously. So if we all go back to work, what does that mean in terms of emissions? And then the thing that I think is going to be the next era is, well, what's the social equity and worker inclusion issues that it need to be taken into account when it comes to the role of transportation? So it's going to be fascinating and so exciting to see a society, whether it's Australia or anywhere else, change as a result of these new inputs affecting the way in which we move.
Making that question probably a little broader, looking ahead, what would your aspirations be for BCSD Australia and then that broader sustainability landscape in the next decade, so beyond transport?
Oh, well, world dominance, but
Of course, yeah.
that's the day after tomorrow. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And when you think about it, that's 2035. That's not that far away.
No.
That's scarily close. And in our world, the world of the geeky sustainability professional, 2035 has an important significance because it obviously comes after 2030, and that's the date upon which the role and the work of the Sustainable Development Goals, in one sense, is supposed to be an end, which is going to be fascinating because we're nowhere near achieving any form of substantive adherence to the way in which those was set up to help us guide our future direction. But it also is, pardon me, 5 years after our Australian target in relation to emissions reduction. And 2035 is when we're going to be committing to our next target in relation to emissions. So why don't I kind of put all that into the mix? Because I think what lies ahead is a really fervent period of building on what we've already started, rather than always going back to square one and thinking, oh, the emissions are so high, we're going to go over we're going to go to 2.9 or 3.1, as I heard today, over baseline. And, that's just terrible. That's true. But we've begun so much change within the existing system that what we need to is lean in and build from, rather than necessarily start from first principles around. My personal view is that I'd love BCSDA members to be leading across the Asia Pacific in areas of climate targets, circular economy leadership, and social impact. I mean, that's what we're working on at the moment. But to be blunt, it's not just about metrics. It really is about transformation of the business model. And our work at BCSD reminds us that we're not just here to optimize the old system. We're actually here to build a better one. And that's no mean feat. I think that our work and the outputs that we have, whether it's the work we do on reporting matters, whether it's the work we do through our weekly report on ESG Snapshot, reminds me and the members, and hopefully those who get to read it externally, that right across the areas of energy, mobility, to materials, finance, social resilience, the goal really has to be for business to move from reporting what's been done to shaping what's coming next. Because reporting is only a reflection of performance. It's not performance in itself. It's about revealing what value you've created by reason of the action that you've taken. But why don't you think more deeply, business, about shaping what that action is going to look like in a more profound way? Because, You want to be here for the next 100 years if you've been already here for the last 100 years. But you want to be here with a ready consumer audience that's going to buy, engage, and supply to you in a way that we have not historically done. So I guess at the end of the day, it would be a mission of turning Australian business into a global sustainability benchmark.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time on the podcast today. Super interesting conversation, and definitely some things to think about in terms of what might happen in the future. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Oh, no, not hopefully, will. They will. As God is my witness, they will happen. May not happen overnight, but it will happen. I forgot what commercial that's from.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.